What if the knights of the Middle Ages, the icons of honor, courage, and devotion, carried a secret that history never wrote in their songs? Behind the armor and the oaths of loyalty, some chronicles hint at bonds between men that went far beyond friendship. Knights wrote poems for their squires, shared beds during long campaigns, and swore love in words that blurred the line between duty and desire. The church called it sin. The poets called it beauty. And somewhere between the two, truth quietly survived. Were these relationships spiritual, romantic, or something that chivalry itself demanded loyalty proven through forbidden affection? The answer lies hidden in letters, ballads, and silence. Tell me the time you're watching Morning, Late Night, or somewhere between. And if you like history told as it truly was, not how legend polished it, hit subscribe, no pressure. They call it the Age of Chivalry, but you soon realize it's less about shiny armor and more about how people pretended to polish their souls while polishing their reputations. Picture yourself in a damp stone castle somewhere in 13th century Europe, torches flickering against the walls and the air thick with incense sweat and politics. You're a young knight, or at least trying to look like one, learning how to balance your sword, your manners, and your secrets. Everyone's obsessed with honor, but no one agrees on what honor actually means. Knighthood, in theory, is about loyalty to God, to one's lord, and to one's lady. But in practice, the real devotion often happens between men. You eat together, fight together, sleep side by side under damp blankets after a long campaign. It's not hard to imagine that affection grows quietly under layers of duty and armor. The poets call it brotherly love, but that's just a polite way of saying emotions ran far deeper than the church would ever approve. Think about it when the Code of Chivalry says, a knight must love purely and serve faithfully who's actually standing beside him through every danger. It's not the lady in the tower, it's the squire holding his shield. Real intimacy in the medieval world isn't built in courtrooms. It's forged in mudblood and candlelight. Would you have managed to hide your feelings behind vows of silence and armor that squeaked with guilt? One of the earliest glimpses of such bonds comes from the chansons de geste, those epic poems about heroic warriors like Roland and Olivier. The Song of Roland, written around the 11th century, describes their relationship with the kind of tenderness usually reserved for lovers. Roland dies in battle, and Olivier's grief reads like heartbreak, not just friendship. Medieval audiences didn't flinch at this affection between men, was seen as noble spiritual, even until moral reformers later reinterpreted everything through suspicion. By the 12th century, the concept of chivalry had spread across Europe. Knights swore oaths of love and loyalty that sometimes sounded uncannily like wedding vows. They'd exchange rings or tokens, call each other beloved companion, and write poems of devotion. You could almost say the medieval code gave men a socially acceptable script for expressing affection toward each other, as long as no one said the quiet part out loud. But silence was its own language. In castles, gestures spoke louder than words, a hand on a shoulder before battle, a look across the hall that lingered a beat too long. You'd hear laughter by the fire, the metallic clink of goblets, the clatter of boots, normal sounds of camaraderie. But beneath them, an unspoken rhythm pulsed. No one wrote it down yet. Everyone felt it. Sometimes loyalty even surpassed family ties. The Order of the Garter in England or the Knights Templar in the Holy Land had rituals of brotherhood so intense they bordered on marriage ceremonies. Members swore to protect one another unto death, and chroniclers noted their unusual devotion. Of course, later critics, usually clerics, found these bonds suspiciously intimate. It's almost ironic the same church that blessed brotherhood condemned affection when it became too visible. You might wonder, was everyone pretending not to see it? Partly yes. Chivalry thrived on performance, how you looked, how you spoke, how you carried your sword. The body itself was a stage. Armor didn't just protect, it sculpted. It accentuated strength, form, presence. When knights praised each other's bravery or beauty in tournaments, the admiration sometimes slipped into adoration. And why not, in an age obsessed with symbols, admiration could disguise itself as virtue. There's a story from the Burgundian court about two knights, Jacques de Lalaing and Pierre de Luxembourg, whose friendship was the talk of the nobles. They trained, jousted, and even commissioned poems for each other's victories. The chroniclers called their bond pure and knightly, but the emotion underneath was unmistakable. You can almost see them sharing glances during a banquet wine, catching the candlelight between them. Chivalry demanded secrecy not because affection was rare, but because hypocrisy was necessary. The higher the ideal, the darker the shadow it cast. The church preached purity while blessing crusaders who slaughtered in God's name. Nobles spoke of honor while plotting each other's downfall. And amid all this quiet companionship between men became one of the few genuine things left. Maybe that's why it scared people. It was too real. Modern psychologists might call it emotional intimacy. Medieval poets called it the heart's alliance. Either way, you can sense it in every verse and vow. Imagine sitting by a fire after a day of battle, sharing bread and exhaustion with another knight. He leans his shoulder against yours, not out of romance, but out of something older and harder to name. You don't talk about it. You just know. Centuries later, scholars would try to separate spiritual friendship from sinful desire, as if one could exist without touching the other. But in the age of chivalry, emotions didn't fit neat categories. They lived in gestures, glances, shared silences. And that's where you begin, among the creaking halls, the oaths, the armor, and the quiet, dangerous warmth of loyalty that meant more than words could admit. You start as a page, a child with calloused hands and wide eyes carrying goblets, sweeping halls and watching knights move like gods of iron. You're told to learn grace, discipline, and obedience. But no one tells you that growing up in a castle means growing up inside someone else's legend. You fetch the Lord's armor, polish it, until your reflection trembles across the steel. And in the process, you start to notice everything. The curve of his jaw under chainmail, the way his eyes soften when no one else is watching. In the medieval world, apprenticeship is intimacy. A page doesn't just serve, he observes. Every movement is a lesson. Every mistake a humiliation shared in front of your master. You tie his belts, fasten his greaves, brush his hair before court. Imagine the trust required, letting a trembling 12-year-old adjust the strap beneath your chin, the one that could decide whether you breathe in battle or not. The bond between knight and page grows out of proximity, the daily exchange of dependence and admiration. Later, when you become a squire, things deepen. Now you sleep near his quarters, tend his horse wake when he wakes. You train under his supervision, mimicking his every motion until your body moves like his. In that repetition, affection hides. In the friction of practice swords, in the steadying touch after a fall, in the glance that lasts a moment too long. Can you tell where duty ends and devotion begins? The education of a young squire isn't only about combat, it's about imitation. You learn courage by watching how he faces fear, courtesy by seeing how he speaks to nobles, restraint by noticing what he never says aloud. Many historical accounts, like those describing the training of French squires in the 14th century, mention the love between master and boy as a virtue, a tool to inspire loyalty. Of course, what began as moral training sometimes crossed into something deeper. Something the chroniclers only hinted at by calling it special affection. If you peek into castle life, the lines blur fast. A knight may take pride in his squire's beauty, the way a modern mentor might brag about a student's talent, half pride, half possession. It's not rare to find poems or letters describing the squire's golden hair, soft voice, or the sadness of parting when the boy left for his own knighthood. One 13th century Provençal knight even wrote, "I have raised him as my own heart, and now he must go where I cannot follow." Tell me, have you ever had a teacher or mentor whose approval meant more than victory itself? Training was brutal, yes, but it also had its tenderness. Think of it like modern military boot camp, without the swear words, exhaustion, camaraderie, dependence. When you spend every day wrestling with the same person, cleaning the same wounds, tending the same horses, something chemical changes in your brain. Loyalty becomes oxygen. There's a surviving manual, Livre de Chivalry, by Geoffroy de Charny, a real knight who lived in 14th century France, advising that a squire's love for his lord should be the foundation of honor. The text reads almost like relationship advice disguised as moral instruction. He must serve him faithfully, not out of fear, but out of love. It's fascinating how that one word, love, keeps showing up in documents that were supposed to be about combat. And then there's the unspoken education of touch. You learn when to help your knight into armor, when to step back, when to speak, when to disappear. A misplaced hand, an overlong pause, those could spark rumors faster than wildfire and dry straw. Yet everyone knew that the knight-squire bond was the emotional backbone of chivalry. Without it, courage meant nothing. You didn't fight for abstract causes. You fought for the man who taught you to hold the sword. Some historians compare this relationship to the pedagogical eros of ancient Greece, where mentorship and affection intertwined under strict moral codes. But medieval Europe wasn't Athens. It was colder, rougher, and far more paranoid. The church tolerated male bonding as long as it looked holy and stayed quiet. Once it drew too much warmth, too much attention, it became dangerous. Still, within the stone walls, the rules softened. After a long day of drills, the castle would hum with quiet laughter. Pages played dice in corners, squires whispered jokes, knights removed their gauntlets and stretched sore hands by the fire. You'd hear fragments of songs from the kitchen, the clatter of plates fading into soft murmurs. Somewhere in that dim glow, affection slipped through the cracks like candle smoke. Modern parallels aren't hard to find. Think of teachers, coaches, or mentors who shape young lives with both discipline and care. The line between authority and affection is always delicate, easily misunderstood. In medieval times, those lines were blurred not by malice, but by a world that offered no language for emotional complexity between men. You learned loyalty through closeness, restraint through longing, and virtue through silence. So as you grow from page to squire, and from squire to knight, your education is not only in swordsmanship, it's in the art of concealment. You master the gesture that means everything, but says nothing. You learn to smile at banquets, and to stand still when your heart is restless. Because in this world of chivalry, survival isn't just about bravery. It's about learning which kind of love you're allowed to show, and which kind must stay hidden behind polished steel. You leave the training yard behind and find yourself in the glittering chaos of court life tapestries, minstrels, perfumed corridors, and the endless dance of flattery. The age of courtly love is in full bloom, and poets everywhere are writing about unattainable women with golden hair, alabaster skin, and moral perfection that no real person could ever match. But you soon notice something odd. Most of those poems sound suspiciously familiar, like they were written by someone who'd never spent much time around actual women. The troubadours of southern France and northern Italy loved to sing about noble ladies, but the emotional intensity, the passion, the devotion, the trembling loyalty often came straight from the language of male friendship. Historians have long suspected that many of these love songs were coded. They weren't just about the lady, but about another knight, a lord, or even a companion in arms. You could think of it as medieval social camouflage. Write a love poem to your friend, but pretend it's to his sister. The concept of fin amour, pure, idealized love, allowed people to express overwhelming admiration while hiding behind metaphors. A knight could swear eternal loyalty to another man. Under the guise of praising a lady, neither of them ever met. It's as if emotion had to wear a disguise to pass through the moral checkpoints of the age. When you read those verses now, you can almost feel the nervous heartbeat beneath the rhymes. Take the troubadour Bernard de Ventadorn, for example. His songs to the lady are full of longing, tears, and submission. But the tone, the language, the metaphors are strikingly similar to those used by men in military or feudal relationships. Loyalty, suffering, obedience, secrecy. These weren't just romantic ideals. They were knightly virtues. And in a world where knights spent nearly all their time with other men, sometimes the arrow of inspiration flew in an unexpected direction. Imagine standing in a great hall lit by 100 candles. A minstrel sings of the fair one, whose glance redeems me. Everyone nods politely, assuming it's about the count's wife, while the singer's eyes quietly rest on the count himself. There's no confrontation, no scandal, just a shared understanding that art can say what the tongue cannot. Poetry becomes confession, and performance becomes protection. Of course, the church wasn't amused. By the 13th century, clerics began denouncing courtly love as dangerous, too passionate, too emotional, too indulgent. But they missed the point. For many knights and poets, these songs weren't about lust at all. They were about expressing devotion in a language the church couldn't quite censor. Some scholars even argue that the entire culture of chivalric romance was an elaborate emotional code built to navigate forbidden feelings. Think of it like a medieval version of subtext in movies today. You watch two actors exchange a look that says everything their script can't. That's exactly what the troubadours were doing, only with lutes and parchment. The lady was often a decoy, a literary shield behind which vulnerability could survive. Some of the most famous examples come from Germany's Minnesänger tradition poets like Walter von der Vogelweide and Reinmar von Hagenau, where knights wrote about loyalty to a lord with the same trembling reverence used for lovers. My heart is yours. One poem declares, though I may never speak it. To modern readers, it sounds romantic. To medieval ones, it sounded virtuous. Both were right. In courts across Europe, especially in France and Italy, nobles held love contests, formal events where poets and knights competed to describe the highest form of affection. Judges were often women, but the performers were men, and the feelings they described often came from personal experience shared between them. It's not unlike modern social media challenges, except with fewer filters and a lot more chainmail. And then there were the gestures. The gift of a glove, the exchange of a ribbon, the secret promise made before a duel. The symbolism of these rituals often exceeded their surface meaning. When a knight wore another man's token into battle, it wasn't just a show of respect, it was an act of devotion. That ribbon wasn't always from a lady. The chronicler Jean de Joinville once described King Louis XII's knights weeping openly when their comrades fell, cradling the dying men as one would a beloved. In an age when stoicism was preached from every pulpit, these moments of vulnerability revealed something far more human than the polished ideals of chivalry. The tension between performance and sincerity defined the entire culture. Chivalry demanded emotional restraint, yet celebrated love as the highest virtue. How could you love purely without feeling deeply? How could you swear loyalty without attachment? The answer was to speak in riddles to praise a lady, but means something else entirely. You might smile at the irony. A society that prized honor forced its most honest emotions into hiding. But maybe that's why the poetry still feels alive. The troubadour's coded confessions became a refuge for everything unsayable. Longing, grief, loyalty, admiration. And in those verses, behind every mention of a fair maiden's smile, there lingers the echo of another man's name, unspoken, yet unmistakable. You've been hearing the songs and seeing the glances, but now the air grows colder. The church has entered the room. And when the church stares, it doesn't blink. You can almost feel its gaze pressed down on your conscience like a mailed fist wrapped in velvet. Sermons echo through the chapels, unnatural affection, sodomy, sins against nature. The language grows sharper than any sword. And suddenly what was once called brotherhood is whispered about as corruption. At first, the church doesn't fully understand what it's fighting. In early medieval Europe, close male friendships were not only tolerated, but celebrated. Monks like Aelred of Rievaulx wrote openly in the 12th century about spiritual friendship, describing love between men as a reflection of divine affection. Friend cleaving to friend, he said, in the spirit of Christ. It sounded holy enough, but the same passage centuries later would make inquisitors squirm. The turning point comes with moral panic and confession manuals. By the 13th century, church scholars begin to catalog sins with an obsessive precision that borders on paranoia. The penitent must not conceal acts of indecent familiarity, warns one guide. Translation: we've started watching even your hugs. Confessors are trained to ask about everything. Were you touched what you felt, what you thought at night? Private emotion becomes public property. You, as a knight, live under two masters, your lord and your priest. One commands loyalty, the other commands purity, and their definitions of love could not be more different. Imagine kneeling in a dark confessional, your armor clanking softly as a weary priest sighs. Have you loved too fondly? You hesitate. The question sounds simple, but you know it isn't. This scrutiny doesn't only live in words, it becomes policy. Under rulers like King Edward II of England, who faced relentless rumors about his affection for his companion, Piers Gaveston, suspicion of same-sex intimacy becomes a weapon of politics. Edward's enemies didn't accuse him of treason. First, they accused him of loving wrongly. Love in that sense became a liability more dangerous than betrayal. The church's fear had less to do with desire and more to do with control. The body was supposed to belong to God, not to feeling. Any affection that slipped beyond the altar's authority threatened the entire moral order. So priests thundered from pulpits. Kings issued decrees and scribes quietly erased stories that didn't fit the new narrative. You could say censorship became a kind of exorcism. And yet in the monasteries where vows of silence reigned, affection still found cracks to live in. Imagine the irony: build a place where men live, pray, and sleep together for decades, and then expect no affection to grow. Monks were human, so were cumin. They shared meals, sickness, and secrets. Some found in each other the compassion they were told to reserve for God. One 14th century abbot in Italy complained that his monks clung to each other more tenderly than to the cross. He meant it as a rebuke, but it reads now like a love letter buried in resentment. Historians even found marginal notes, scribbled prayers, poems, or doodles that reveal quiet humor and companionship behind those cloistered walls. The stricter the rules, the more creativity affection found to survive. Of course, public punishments grew harsher. In cities like Florence and Paris, moral courts began hunting what they called unnatural vice. But even then, hypocrisy ruled the day. Some of the same nobles who condemned others for such acts were rumored to host brotherhood banquets of suspicious intimacy. The church thundered in Latin, but the streets whispered in vernacular. Love always finds a language of its own. You might think all this repression would extinguish tenderness, but the opposite happened. It made affection more careful, more coded, more sacred in its secrecy. Every glance carried weight. Every word had to double as camouflage. Lovers became experts in silence, the same silence monks used in prayer. It's strange, isn't it? The more the church preached sin, the more people learned devotion by hiding it. In trying to purify the body, they made the soul ache louder. Picture a knight kneeling at Mass beside his sworn companion, their shoulders brushing just once. The choir sings Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, and in that moment both the sacred and the forbidden share a heartbeat. Even the art of confession, meant to cleanse guilt, became a paradox. Men who spoke too freely risked punishment. Men who stayed silent risked damnation. It was a no-win game played in whispers. Perhaps that's why so many knights turned to poetry, to allegory, to prayer as disguise. Writing became a loophole, the only place the forbidden could live without a body. You can almost hear the echo. Every sermon railing against sin is also a confession of fascination. The church's obsession reveals how deeply the subject haunted it. Maybe that's the most medieval truth of all. That what they condemned most fiercely, they couldn't stop thinking about. The noise of battle fades, replaced by the hush of cloisters and candlelight. You find yourself walking through the corridors of a monastery, stone arches echoing your footsteps, the air thick with beeswax incense, and the faint scent of damp parchment. If the castles of knights were built for action, these abbeys were built for stillness. And yet stillness has its own kind of temptation. Monastic life is meant to strip you of the world. No wealth, no family, no passion. But it doesn't strip you of need. The monks who wake before dawn to chant matins are still flesh and bone, and emotion doesn't evaporate just because it's called unholy. You share everything here. Food robes silence the rhythm of prayer. The body may belong to God, but the heart still looks for warmth in the cold stone nights. Historians sometimes call monasteries laboratories of the soul, but they were also laboratories of human closeness. Inside, every gesture becomes meaningful. The passing of a cup, the tightening of a belt, the simple act of bandaging a wound. There are no women, no families, no crowds, only each other. So where does affection go when the world forbids it? It seeps into the quiet like water through cracks in a wall. There's a famous letter by Peter Abelard, the 12th century philosopher who once scandalized Paris with his affair with Heloise. After his castration and exile to monastic life, his letters take on a new tone, melancholy, tender, and strangely compassionate toward his male students. We must comfort one another in exile, he writes. Our hearts, though bound by obedience, are not made of stone. It's a small sentence, but it feels like a rebellion disguised as theology. You might imagine monks as saints, but many were just people trying to balance guilt and longing. The rule of Saint Benedict told them to avoid familiarity, especially with younger brothers, yet records from across Europe show that warnings were repeated so often because they kept being ignored. There's a dry humor to that. When something gets forbidden, 10 times you can guess how often it happened. In one English abbey, a 13th century visitation report scolds a prior for keeping a special companion in his private chamber. The bishop's tone is half outrage, half resignation. The punishment, relocation, not execution. Even moral guardians knew when to look away. They feared scandal more than sin. It's a very medieval kind of hypocrisy, keep appearances holy, and everything else can stay between the cloister walls. But beyond scandal, there's the tenderness. Imagine two monks in the scriptorium copying manuscripts side by side for hours. Quills scratching candles, sputtering one of them, softly humming a hymn under his breath. The silence isn't lonely, it's full of unspoken companionship. When one falls ill, the other tends him. When one dies, the other writes his name in the necrology, a small act of eternity inked onto parchment. How do you separate duty from love in moments like that? Somewhere in France, at the Abbey of Saint Victor, letters survive, where brothers exchange blessings that sound a lot like love notes. "I kiss you in spirit," one writes. Another replies, "Your absence wounds me, yet I rejoice that you serve God." They speak in spiritual metaphors, but the emotion underneath is unmistakably human. If you've ever texted someone at midnight with a message you claim is just checking in, you already understand how confession can double as affection. What makes these monastic connections so striking is that they existed right under the church's nose. The same institution that condemned desire also built spaces where it could survive in silence. And sometimes silence is stronger than speech. In that silence, you hear the rustle of robes brushing past in narrow halls, the faint laughter during chores, the sigh before Compline when another day of restraint ends. Modern scholars sometimes call these celibate loves, relationships shaped by rules but not erased by them. The monks weren't rebels. They were survivors of a spiritual paradox. They sought God, but found fragments of him in each other. The human heart, it turns out, doesn't follow canon law. It follows recognition the moment when someone looks at you, truly sees you, and still stays. There were saints who blurred the lines further. Take Saint Elred of Rivaux again, the abbot who wrote Spiritual Friendship. He argued that divine love and human love weren't enemies, that affection between men could be holy if guided by virtue. "He who dwells in love dwells in God." He quoted from Scripture, daring to make the Church's own words his defense. It's hard not to admire that courage. He found a loophole in faith itself. In the dim light of the chapel, monks sing psalms that echo off stone walls older than memory. You kneel beside them listening. Their voices blend into one current of sound, neither purely sacred nor purely human. It's devotion, discipline, and longing, braided together so tightly that no bishop could ever untangle it. So while the world outside the monastery sharpens its swords and judges inside, love learns to whisper in Latin. It becomes invisible, but not gone. It hides in prayer, in the margins of manuscripts, in the rhythm of shared breath. Maybe that's the strangest miracle of all, that even in the strictest silence, the heart still finds ways to speak. You've spent enough time behind monastery walls. The door swings open, and the air outside smells of iron sweat and foreign dust. The Crusades are calling armies of knights crossing continents to liberate holy lands, banners snapping against desert winds. Here, amid the chaos of faith and fire, brotherhood turns into something deeper, darker, and harder to define. You march side by side with men who share your every breath. The rhythm of boots on sand replaces prayer bells. Each night, the same tent, the same stories, the same laughter to fend off fear. In the Holy Land, boundaries blur quickly between courage and madness, loyalty and love, heaven and survival. Out here, the Church's eyes feel far away. You could almost forget what you're not supposed to feel. Chroniclers often describe the Crusader camps as places of fellowship stronger than blood. That's not poetic exaggeration. When men spend months traveling from France or England to Jerusalem, surviving starvation, disease, and ambush, their trust in one another becomes absolute. A knight who watches your back at dawn earns a devotion the poets could barely contain in verse. The military orders, like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, perfected this fusion of faith and intimacy. The Templars, in particular, took vows of chastity, obedience, and brotherhood. They lived trained and died together. Their initiation rituals were secret, filled with oaths and symbolic kisses. The church blessed them at first, seeing them as holy warriors. Later, when suspicion grew, those same rituals would be twisted into accusations of heresy and indecent acts. History, as usual, rewrote love into crime. One of the Templar rules commanded that brothers must love one another with pure charity. Another insisted they sleep in shared dormitories, eat together in silence, and obey one another as extensions of their own will. The practical reason was discipline. The emotional result was something far stronger, an unspoken intimacy that could survive even torture. When the order was destroyed in the early 1300s, many knights refused to betray each other under interrogation. Loyalty for them had become indistinguishable from love. Imagine the scene: a campfire flickering beneath foreign stars, armor stacked in neat piles, the distant murmur of prayer. You sit shoulder to shoulder with your brothers in arms, the heat of the fire reflected in your eyes. No ladies here, no courtly songs, just the quiet truth of proximity and fear. You talk about home, but it feels like another planet. Out here, the only home that exists is the one you build inside someone else's trust. Some historians, like John Boswell, argue that the bonds forged in crusading orders were part of a broader tradition of brother-making rituals that bordered on spiritual marriage. In Byzantium, for example, there was a ceremony called adelphopoiesis, literally making brothers, which joined two men in lifelong union through prayers, shared communion, and the kiss of peace. Western Europe never officially adopted it, but the emotional idea lingered, especially among knights who spent years together abroad. You might think of it as the medieval version of trauma bonding, except instead of therapy, you have sword fights and relics. When every day might be your last, sentimentality becomes practical. Who else will wash your wounds, carry your body if you fall, or guard your memory if you don't come home? Letters from crusaders occasionally hint at this intensity. One French knight wrote to his comrade in 1191 saying, "You are dearer to me than all the gold of Antioch." Another confessed, "Your absence makes my heart weak as if pierced by Saracen arrows." The rhetoric of devotion bled naturally into the language of affection because they were often the same thing. Of course, not everyone looked kindly on such attachments. Clerics scolded soldiers for sinful companionships, warning that proximity to temptation lurked even in the noblest causes. But out in the dust and blood, morality became abstract. The only sins that mattered were betrayal and cowardice. When you stand shoulder to shoulder against death, you stop caring about who loves whom. And yet, the paradox deepens these campaigns, meant to defend purity, expose the rawest forms of humanity. You see men comforting each other after loss, holding hands over shallow graves, weeping without shame. Chroniclers rarely mention these moments. They preferred tales of conquest and glory. But in the margins of some journals, private notes from lesser knights, you find sketches of faces' initials joined by crosses and prayers that sound suspiciously personal. Modern soldiers might recognize this feeling. The foxhole intimacy, the wordless bond formed under fire, it hasn't changed much. The difference is that medieval knights wrapped it in theology instead of psychology. They called it brotherhood, divine fellowship, or holy love. The labels didn't matter. What mattered was that someone stood beside you when the world collapsed. As the Crusades drag on, many knights return home, changed not just by violence, but by the memory of how deeply they once trusted and how much they lost. You can't unlearn that kind of closeness. It lingers like the scent of burning incense long after the altar's been cleared. So when the banners finally fall and the ships sail back to Europe, the Age of Chivalry carries something invisible in its luggage, the idea that love between men could be forged not only in art or prayer, but in battle. You don't call it passion, you call it loyalty. You don't call it sin, you call it survival. Every age has its scandals, but few hide theirs in armor. The chivalric world that once praised loyalty now begins to punish it, especially when loyalty strays too close to love. You walk through a court where gossip travels faster than arrows, and words like unnatural and unmanly start whispering behind closed doors. The line between devotion and disgrace tightens until even friendship starts to tremble under suspicion. By the late Middle Ages, Europe is obsessed with control of body, speech, and desire. Kings use morality as a weapon. The church uses confession as surveillance. Suddenly, every rumor of too much affection becomes political currency. And if history loves anything, it's a scandal wrapped in righteousness. Take King Edward II of England, whose story is almost too dramatic for fiction. Chroniclers claimed he adored his companion Piers Gaveston beyond all reason, lavishing him with titles, jewels, and the kind of emotional dependence that terrified nobles. One chronicler wrote that the king felt toward him such love that he could not bear his absence. To his enemies, that line alone was enough to ignite rebellion. Gaveston was executed. Edward was deposed, and according to dark legend, murdered in a way designed to mock that very affection. Historians debate the details, but the symbolism lingers like smoke. Power itself had turned intimacy into spectacle. You see it again in the court of Richard the Lionheart, a crusader king whose closeness with Philip II of France scandalized chroniclers. They swore oaths together, dined from the same plate, and even shared a bed. Not out of lust, one writer insists, but out of great affection. The need to justify that line says everything. You can feel the discomfort of an age that could celebrate brotherhood, but not tenderness. And it wasn't just kings. In 14th century France, the Knights Templar were accused of blasphemy and forbidden acts between brothers during their secret initiation rites. The charges were likely exaggerated by King Philip IV to seize their wealth. But the language of the trial tells a deeper story. Europe's growing panic about male intimacy. The Templars, who had once embodied holiness and discipline, suddenly became symbols of corruption. When loyalty grows too strong, it starts to look like rebellion. Even literature begins to shift tone. Where troubadours once sang of noble friendship, later poets write of betrayal, punishment, and moral decay. The same language that once disguised affection now disguises fear. You can almost hear the nervous laughter between lines of verse, as if the writers themselves are tiptoeing around forbidden memories. And yet repression never really works. It only changes costume. Scandal becomes entertainment. Nobles trade rumors about who's too fond of his companion, who wept at another man's trial, who wrote one too many flattering sonnets. In Florence, moral courts start documenting crimes against nature. But those same records reveal networks of friendship and affection so intricate, they read more like social diaries than criminal ledgers. The punishments were public. The emotions were private. Both endured. You might wonder how anyone dared express affection at all under such scrutiny. The answer is simple. They turned it into ritual. Knights began creating secret brotherhoods, private vows, and coded gestures of loyalty that skirted accusation. Two men might exchange relics, touch swords, in symbolic blessing, or share the Eucharist in a side chapel. To outsiders, it was piety. To them, it was remembrance. Not all stories ended in tragedy. In Burgundy, Duke Philip the Good's court records mention pairs of knights referred to as Amis Charnel's beloved friends. The term wasn't scandalous yet. It appeared in songs and dedications, without shame. One 15th century chronicler even wrote that such friendships ennobled the heart and strengthened courage. It's a reminder that acceptance and fear always coexisted, flickering like two flames from the same torch. Still, the higher the status, the greater the risk. Kings could be ruined by rumor. Knights could be disgraced by a glance. The laws against sodomy weren't new, but the enforcement became theatrical burnings, confessions, even forced public recantations. The spectacle wasn't just about punishment. It was about deterrence. If love could inspire courage, it could also inspire defiance, and that terrified those in power. Imagine standing in a crowded square as a condemned man confesses to unnatural affection, his voice trembling, the crowd murmuring like wind through trees. The clergy chant, the fire crackles, and somewhere in that chaos, you recognize the absurdity how love, the most private thing in the world, had become a public performance of fear. And yet some still wrote. Secret poems circulated in courts' letters, sealed in wax, carried across borders. A knight might write to his former comrade, "I serve no lady, for my heart is already sworn." No names, no confessions, just coded loyalty disguised as piety. You can almost hear the heartbeat behind the words, the pulse of someone who refuses to forget. It's strange how history punishes what it cannot name. The same chronicles that condemned Edward II for loving too much also praised his bravery and compassion. They never saw that the two were connected, that tenderness, not cruelty, was his inheritance. Maybe that's why the age of chivalry eventually collapsed under its own contradictions. It built a world where love between men was both the foundation of honor and the seed of disgrace. By now you've seen the pattern. The church condemns the poets, disguise, the kings deflect, and the people gossip. But through every layer of fear affection, endures burned, buried, rewritten, yet somehow still breathing beneath the armor. You retreat from the noise of politics into quieter chambers, the world of parchment and ink, where feelings could finally breathe under disguise. The age of knights may be fading, but the quills are busier than ever. Chronicles, love songs, allegories. Every line becomes a hiding place for longing. And if the battlefield was where men swore loyalty, the written page is where they confessed it. The medieval mind adored symbols. Everything, colors, flowers, stars, even animals had hidden meaning. So when a poet writes of two falcons that soar together but cannot land on the same branch, it isn't just nature poetry. It's code. Desire needed camouflage, and metaphor became the safest armor of all. Geoffrey Chaucer understood this game well. In The Knight's Tale, he tells of Palamon and Arcite, two noble prisoners who both fall in love with the same woman, Emily. On the surface, it's a competition for her affection, but if you listen carefully, their emotional intensity for each other eclipses the woman entirely. Their bond, their rivalry, their grief when one dies, it's drenched in something that feels more personal than chivalric duty. It's as if Emily is a mirror rather than a muse. Writers across Europe were doing the same, crafting double stories that could be read one way aloud and another way in silence. In Dante's Purgatorio, you meet Guido Guinizelli, a poet of the sweet new style whose verses about noble love carried undertones of mentorship and male admiration. The language is tender, precise, reverent. Dante greets him as a spiritual father. Is it friendship? Is it something more? The text never says, but the silence speaks volumes. In France, Chrétien de Troyes gave us Lancelot, the knight whose love for Queen Guinevere defines courtly passion. But hidden in those same pages are bonds between knights described with equal devotion, Gawain and Yvain Lancelot and Galho. Galho, in particular, is fascinating, a noble giant who sacrifices everything for Lancelot's happiness, even arranging his friend's meeting with the queen. When Galho dies of grief, Lancelot mourns him as one would a lover. Medieval audiences wept, but later editors cut or softened that part. Love, it seems, was easier to swallow if it stayed heterosexual in hindsight. You can imagine the scene of a scribe hunched over a manuscript by candlelight, carefully illuminating the letter L with gold leaf, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, that the story he's copying hides emotions forbidden by the pulpit. Sometimes the margins tell the truth. The main text can't. Small drawings, two knights embracing hearts pierced by swords. Initials entwined still survive in manuscripts from England to Italy. Scholars call them decorations. Maybe they're declarations. Even theology wasn't immune. Mystical writers like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux used a language of yearning so intense it bordered on sensual. His commentary on the Song of Songs. A book already famous for its poetic passion reads like a love letter to the divine that often slips into the register of human desire. His God is not distant. He is a lover who kisses, embraces wounds, and heals. It's easy to see how those words could blur into something personal when read in candlelit solitude. And then there's the anonymous poetry, the safest kind. Across medieval Europe, short verses circulated that praised the comrade of my heart, or the one whose glance redeems me. No names, no genders, just emotion so vivid it refuses to fit the categories. Maybe that's what makes them timeless. When the church policed love, anonymity became the last sanctuary of honesty. Sometimes literature did more than hide, it defied. The 13th century French poet Routebeuf wrote about a monk expelled for loving too deeply. His tone wasn't moral outrage. It was sorrow. He mocked hypocrites who punished affection but indulged in greed. You hate what is tender, he wrote, but not what is cruel. In an age of censorship, satire was the one weapon no bishop could fully tame. If you look closely, you'll see a quiet rebellion running beneath the ink. The poets knew that truth could survive disguise. Every metaphor of light and shadow, every prayer for a beloved soul, every lament for a fallen comrade, was another spark in a centuries-long conversation about what it means to love honestly in a dishonest world. Maybe you've read something similar without realizing it, a line that stays with you, because it feels familiar, even if you can't explain why. That's the echo of those old voices. They weren't just writing about their time. They were writing about ours, too. A world that still fears tenderness, but craves it all the same. When you close one of those manuscripts, the ink still gleams faintly, as if breathing. It's not just pigment, it's pulse. You can almost hear the writer whisper, through the centuries, if they cannot see us, they cannot silence us. The parchment curls softly as the candle burns low, and for a moment it feels like the whole history of forbidden love is folded inside that fragile page. You wake in a quieter century where the clang of armor softens into the rustle of silk and parchment. The age of chivalry has aged, and with it new stories appear this time, about disguised transformation and people who dared to step outside the narrow borders of gender itself. If earlier centuries hid affection behind coded words, this one hides it inside costumes. It starts with legends of saints, always the safest place to smuggle subversion. In medieval hagiographies, you find women dressing as men to join monasteries or escape forced marriages. Their motives are usually framed as piety, but the details suggest something richer, a quiet challenge to identity itself. Saint Eugenia, for instance, left her noble home, disguised herself as a monk, and lived among men for years. When she was finally discovered, her biographer quickly added divine visions to make the story respectable. But the implication lingered. The boundary between male and female could be crossed by courage, not sin. Then there's Saint Marina, who disguised herself as a monk to follow her father into monastic life. When falsely accused of fathering a child, she stayed silent, choosing exile and humility rather than revealing her identity. Centuries of readers admired her virtue, but they also marveled at her strength, her ambiguity. Was Marina's story really about chastity? Or was it about freedom from labels that never fit in the first place? Outside the cloisters, legends of female knights begin to appear. In France, tales of Jehanne la Pucelle, Joan of Arc, ignite both awe and fear. She rides in armor, commands men, and refuses to wear dresses, even under threat of execution. To her, clothing is obedience to mission, not rebellion against nature. Yet as the English court condemned her for cross-dressing, her defiance became immortal. You can still hear her voice clear, young and unafraid, telling her judges, "It is for God, not you, to judge me." These stories of disguise aren't just about women. They're mirrors reflecting the whole gender anxiety of the age. Men who were too gentle risked suspicion. Women who were too brave risked the stake. So society invented elaborate performances, chivalric tournaments, masks, religious dramas, where everyone could briefly play at being someone else. The irony. Those moments of pretense often revealed the truest selves. In Italian and French courts, masquerade balls became an excuse for fluidity. Nobles swapped costumes, men appeared as maidens, and laughter disguised transgression. The poet Eustache Deschamps once wrote that in play, truth wears a mask. He wasn't joking. Gender in those candlelit halls became theater. The rule was simple: so long as you danced, no one asked who you really were. Meanwhile, chroniclers record curious cases, women passing as soldiers, sailors, even monks. Sometimes for love, sometimes for survival. One tale from 15th century Spain tells of Catalina de Arauso, the lieutenant nun who lived years as a man, fought duels and served in the army. When discovered, she refused shame, insisting she was as brave as any knight. The church astonishingly granted her a special dispensation to continue dressing as she pleased. The past, it turns out, was never as simple as the textbooks promise. You might think these cross-dressing saints and warriors were isolated miracles, but their popularity reveals something deeper, a collective fascination with blurred lines. Medieval people didn't have modern vocabulary for gender or sexuality, but they recognized complexity when they saw it. They turned it into parables, sometimes to praise, sometimes to warn, but always to remember. Art followed suit. Illuminated manuscripts began depicting androgynous angels, their faces serene and genderless, their robes flowing like water. Painters like Jan van Eyck gave male saints delicate features and soft hands, while female saints bore the stern gazes of commanders. Divine beauty became ambiguity, perhaps because in heaven, identity no longer needed armor. And then there's romance literature, where disguise becomes destiny. In tales like Ide et Olive or Silence, women disguise themselves as men, fall in love with other women, and only reveal the truth when God or chance intervenes. The twist. The stories rarely end in condemnation. In Ide et Olive, the disguised Ide marries a princess, and when the deception is exposed, an angel transforms her into a man to legitimize their union. It's fantastical, yes, but also quietly radical. A medieval fantasy of love beyond gender, long before modern language existed to describe it. You might smile at the irony. While the church condemned sin, its storytellers kept inventing loopholes that celebrated transformation. Perhaps that's because these tales offered relief. In a world bound by rules, disguise allowed people to breathe. It let them try on forbidden possibilities, if only for a night or for a legend. And maybe that's why these stories endured. They spoke to something everyone understood, but no one dared to name the feeling that who you are and who you must appear to be aren't always the same person. Beneath the armor, beneath the habits, beneath the masks, there was always the same question whispered through history. What if the truest form of loyalty is to yourself? The armor is rusting now. The tournaments are ending. The banners droop in dusty halls, and the poets who once sang of shining honor have gone quiet. You stand at the twilight of the age of chivalry, surrounded by relics of a dream that never quite matched reality. Yet, beneath the fading gilt and the sermons, something survived, a heartbeat that refused to be silenced. When people speak of the medieval world, they imagine strict lines, men in armor, women in towers, priests in pulpits. But after walking through its centuries, you know better. The lines were never straight. They curved, blurred, overlapped like the script in a monk's worn manuscript. Chivalry, for all its rules, became a stage for everything. Unspoken devotion, longing, tenderness, rebellion. Its silence protected what the world would not allow to speak. You think of the knights who rode together through storms and battlefields. Their loyalty mistaken for duty, their grief mistaken for weakness. You think of monks whispering prayers that sounded suspiciously like love letters of poets hiding affection in metaphors about falcons and lilies. You remember women who wore armor and men who wrote about beauty in each other's courage. All of them, in their own ways, were trying to say one thing: love doesn't vanish just because the law can't name it. By the late 15th century, Europe began to change. The Renaissance dawned with new eyes and new hypocrisies. Scholars rediscovered Plato and reinterpreted his dialogues on friendship, while moralists redoubled their sermons. The printing press spread stories faster than the church could burn them. Secret poems, once copied in candlelight, now reached across borders. You could almost say the truth had escaped the script. But here's the twist. The ideals of chivalry, loyalty, courage, faithfulness didn't die. They simply shed their armor and changed shape. When later generations spoke of romantic friendship in the 18th and 19th centuries, or when soldiers in World War I wrote tender letters to each other from the trenches, they were unknowingly repeating the old vows of the knights. The words changed, but the pulse stayed the same. If you listen carefully, history doesn't whisper, it hums. You can still hear it in the language of devotion today, in the ways people talk about loyalty, brotherhood, chosen family. Every handshake between comrades, every "I've got your back," every quiet tear at a funeral carries the DNA of those medieval oaths. The past doesn't vanish. It hides in gestures. The church eventually softened, then hardened again, then forgot the specifics of what it once feared. But the memory of affection, of loyalty beyond logic, endured in art, in stories, in the small mercies of daily life. Maybe that's why the medieval world still fascinates us, because beneath its cruelty and superstition, it understood something modern life sometimes forgets: that love in all its forms is rarely logical, often inconvenient, but always divine in its persistence. You stand now in an empty great hall. The torches have burned down to embers. On the stone walls hang faded shields and torn banners, their colors dim, but still faintly visible. Somewhere outside, a lute player hums a half-forgotten tune, a song once meant for a lady, maybe, or maybe not. The melody drifts through the air, soft, patient, eternal. You can almost imagine a knight's voice joining in singing to someone whose name never made it into the chronicles. You realize the story was never about sin or secrecy. It was about endurance. About how something fragile can outlast steel. About how hearts, no matter the century, keep finding each other in the dark. The age of chivalry may have ended, but the bonds it forged didn't rust away. They seeped into language, art, and memory, quietly immortal. You can still feel them now, even centuries later, in the stories we tell and the songs we hum before sleep. Maybe that's why you're here listening to this tonight. Because part of you recognizes that same unbroken thread, the need to love to be seen, to stay loyal to something invisible but real. So you close your eyes. The sound of hooves fades, replaced by the hum of your own breath. History settles around you like a cloak, heavy, warm, familiar. Somewhere in that vast continuum of time, two knights still ride through dawn mist, silent but unafraid. And you, tracing their story across centuries, realize you were never just watching them. You were remembering them. When the banners fall and the songs of glory fade, you start to wonder what becomes of a knight once the battle ends. The sword dulls the armor, gathers dust, yet the heart still burns for purpose. Beyond the war and honor lies a quieter mystery, the secret lives of knights after the battlefield. The battle is over, but it doesn't feel that way. The air still tastes of iron and smoke, and your ears are ringing with the same high, needling tone that follows a church bell struck too hard. Glory looks different when it's lying face down in the mud. You pick your way across the field, boots sinking into earth, churned into porridge by hooves and blood, and try to count how many of your comrades are still moving. That's the first task of every knight after the fight, not to celebrate, but to count the living. You start by calling out names, half whispered, half prayed. Some answer, some don't. The field is a mix of moaning laughter and that eerie quiet that only comes when men realize they're still alive. Nearby, a soldier who minutes ago shouted, "For St. George," now groans something that sounds more like "for water." You kneel, press a hand to his shoulder, and signal your squire to bring a skin. Even the smallest sip feels like a miracle. There's no grand music here, no banners rippling proudly. Just the dull thud of someone turning over bodies to find friends and the soft, metallic rattle of chainmail when it meets the ground. You notice one of your rivals, yes, the same man you tried to unhorse this morning, now limping with a blood-soaked sleeve. You help him sit. Chivalry, it turns out, doesn't end when the trumpets stop. On a medieval battlefield, mercy is the real badge of honor, though it rarely makes it into the songs. The truth is, knights were trained as much for logistics as for bravery. After battle, they didn't vanish into romantic mist. They organized triage. Think of it like a medieval emergency room with fewer bandages and more prayer. Heralds confirmed who died, scribes noted ransom-worthy prisoners, and squires handled the gruesome cleanup. You, meanwhile, were expected to keep a cool head, because an enemy worth capturing was worth more than one worth killing. It's not easy work. You and your men drag the wounded beneath makeshift tents stitched from torn banners. The stench of sweat, wet leather, and iron fills your nose. You tie off a comrade's arm with a strip of linen, once white, now red. Your squire gags at the sight. You remind him quietly. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's working while your hands shake. He nods and keeps going. If you're lucky, a priest walks among you. He offers blessings as fast as any modern paramedic could hand out gauze. His Latin murmurs blend with the wind, and the flies. Sometimes you wonder if God can even hear him through the noise. But the ritual matters. It keeps order in a place where order has just been torn apart. And speaking of order, there's a strange routine to this chaos. You take note of armor pieces left behind not out of greed, but necessity. Every bit of metal costs a fortune. Stripped helmets and broken swords will later be melted down or reused. Nothing on this ground truly goes to waste, except perhaps idealism. You once thought war was about courage. Tonight, it's about inventory. In a corner of the field, a group of peasants hovers like crows. They're not looters, at least not yet. They've come to find their sons or brothers. You watch one old woman lift the faceplate of a fallen man, then close it again without a word. No one teaches you how to look at that and remain composed. You just keep counting because numbers are easier than grief. Do you ever wonder what all this smelled like? Imagine a mix of wet soil, burnt horsehair, vinegar, and the faint sweetness of crushed grass underfoot. It's not cinematic, it's nauseating. But after hours, your senses adapt. You start noticing smaller things, the pattern of dents on a shield, the soft hiss of a torch, and the drizzle, the feeling of cold air creeping under your armor like judgment itself. When darkness settles, you realize you've been awake since dawn. You haven't eaten, your fingers are raw, and you can still taste adrenaline. Medieval chronicles might talk about victory, but they skip this part, the quiet inventory of survival. Winning simply means you're the one left to clean up. Nearby, a herald begins reciting names again. Each survivor's shout echoes across the camp, here, still breathing. The list sounds more like a roll call at a school than a celebration of conquest. You notice some names get no answer. Those are written down too in ink or in memory. You'll see their widows at the next feast, and you'll lie that they died quickly. Everyone does. Sometimes you look up and see stars blinking through the smoke. You wonder how many other knights across Christendom are staring at the same sky tonight, counting the same losses. Maybe one in France, maybe one in Spain, maybe even one in the Holy Land, doing exactly what you're doing, adding up the cost of survival. And in that moment, you realize something almost modern battle may change. But the aftermath never does. Whether it's arrows or artillerymen still end up asking the same quiet question, who's left? The next morning will bring new sounds, new deals, and a new set of bruises to explain. But for now, you keep counting. Because counting means there's still someone to count. By dawn, the fog smells faintly of ashes and horse sweat. You're stiff sore and coated in mud that dried in streaks across your armor like cracked paint. The battlefield behind you looks almost calm now, like it never held chaos at all. But there's no time for reflection. Mourning after a fight means negotiation. Because if swords ruled, the night silver will rule the morning. You pull your cloak tighter and follow your commander to a tent patched with 3 different coats of arms. Inside, the enemy sits cross-legged, sipping something that might once have been wine. You both nod politely. It's astonishing, really. Yesterday you tried to stab each other through the ribs. And today you're complimenting his horse and talking about ransom fees. Medieval war was full of these paradoxes, bloodshed and bookkeeping sharing the same tent. Ransom wasn't an act of mercy. It was an industry. Capturing a noble alive could make you richer than any raid ever could. You remember what your squire said last night, half joking. A dead knight is worth prayers, but a living one is worth pounds. He wasn't wrong. The code of chivalry may have preached honor, but the market preached louder. You take a seat at the table spread with parchment coins and wax seals. Across from you sits a French knight. Let's call him Geoffroy, whose armor still bears streaks of your sword. His right hand trembles slightly as he signs the terms of his release. You can't tell if it's fear or fatigue. Maybe both. When he looks up, there's a flicker of something you recognize, relief mixed with humiliation. You offer him a nod that says, "I'd hate this too." These quiet deals among enemies kept the machinery of medieval war running smoothly. No one wanted endless slaughter. It was bad for morale, bad for lineage, and bad for business. The church condemned excessive killing, but happily blessed ransom agreements, calling them acts of moderation. You suspect heaven had an accountant too. Sometimes the negotiations felt like a medieval version of corporate mergers. "We'll return your baron if you restore our bridge and release 2 hostages. We'll trade you 30 archers for your captured bishop." It's diplomacy wrapped in chainmail. You'd think knights lived for valor, but on most days, they lived for paperwork. Even looting followed rules. You couldn't just grab whatever you wanted. Technically, spoils were divided by rank. Your lord took the largest share, then captains, then you. Your squire got whatever wasn't nailed down, which usually meant half a boot and someone's dented goblet. Still, you'd find him later polishing it like treasure. Medieval hierarchy survived even in chaos. It was like feudal gravity, inescapable and a bit absurd. As you lean over the table, a monk acting as notary dips his quill into ink thick as tar. He mutters legal phrases you barely understand. Most knights couldn't read, but they trusted the rhythm of Latin like a spell that kept everyone honest. You sign with a shaky cross and press your ring into the wax. The seal hisses softly, cooling like the end of a storm. Outside, a few soldiers cheer. They've just traded prisoners for ale. You watch them clap each other on the shoulders, still limping, still alive. There's something oddly wholesome about men who an hour ago were enemies now arguing over who pays for breakfast. A modern therapist might call it compartmentalization. You just call it Tuesday. If you're wondering whether betrayal was common, yes, spectacularly so. Knights often broke truces if a better offer arrived. One chronicler of the 100 Years' War once complained that peace lasts only until someone's purse runs dry. He wasn't exaggerating. That's why oaths were sworn not just before men, but before relics, bits of saintly bone or splinters from the true cross. Divine witnesses were harder to bribe. Still, even in deceit, there was etiquette. You didn't murder a man at the negotiation table. You waited until he left. You didn't steal a horse from a fellow noble. You bought it later through legal means. Everything had ceremony, even corruption. You recall a story about Bertrand du Guesclin, a famed French commander. Once captured, he reportedly told his captor, "My ransom will be worth more than 10 castles." And it was his friends paid a fortune. To medieval knights, capture wasn't shameful. It was networking. The battlefield made strange friends of enemies and business partners of rivals. Your own ransom experience wasn't so glamorous. Once, years ago, you were caught at Crécy, thrown into a wooden cage, and forced to eat stale bread while your lord debated whether you were worth rescuing. You were barely. The coins came, the door opened, and the lesson stuck. Valor mattered less than valuation. Evening approaches again, and with it the buzz of coin counting fades into the hum of the camp. You step outside, stretching your sore shoulder, and the sight hits you. Banners fluttering side by side, yours, theirs, and others who've joined just for profit. It's like a medieval stock exchange where loyalty is traded daily. You pass your squire, who's crouched by the fire inspecting a dented helmet he scavenged. He looks up. "Did we win?" he asks. You pause. The word win feels too simple for everything that's happened today. The bargaining, the signatures, the polite smiles exchanged over bloodied armor. You tell him, we lived. That's close enough. He nods satisfied and tosses another twig into the flame. The crackle almost sounds like applause. When the last contract is sealed and the camp starts to quiet, your armor suddenly feels 10 times heavier. The truth is, it was never designed for comfort. Taking it off after battle feels less like undressing and more like shedding a second skeleton. You sit on a stool beside your tent while your squire, eyes half closed from exhaustion, begins the ritual of unmaking a knight. First, the straps. There are so many straps. Leather creaks as he unties one buckle after another, each pull releasing a sigh of stale heat. You can feel sweat sliding down your ribs beneath the gambeson your padded underarmor, and the smell hits both of you like a kicked door. Smells like victory, your squire jokes weakly. You reply, smells like boiled goat. He grins. Humor here is as important as holy water. Piece by piece, he lifts the burden off you, the cuirass, the greaves, the vambraces, all dented and smudged with dirt. Each plate lands on the ground with a dull thud, like a metallic heartbeat slowing down. It takes nearly as long to remove the armor as it did to fight in it. You stretch your back, feel the skin there ache as if it's forgotten how to breathe. Beneath everything, you're wearing a linen shirt soaked through and rubbed raw at the seams. The word comfort hasn't been invented yet. Your squire knows the drill. He fetches a bowl of water gone brown from earlier washings. It's lukewarm at best, but it's the only bath you'll get this week. You dip a rag, wipe your arms, and wince when you find bruises blooming in strange places, your ribs painted purple where the armor pinched your shoulder, bruised from the weight of the sword. You look like someone tried to beat a confession out of you and gave up halfway. Medical care, if you can call it that, is improvised. Your squire pulls out a pouch of herbs, comfrey, yarrow, and whatever else he's picked up from the camp physician, and grinds them into a paste with wine. The sting when it touches your skin makes you hiss. He mutters, if it hurts, it's working. You're not sure whether to thank him or curse him. Most knights carried scars like signatures. Each one told a story, though half of them were lies. This one from a Saracen spear. That one from a duel in Lombardy. You know better. Most scars came from falling off horses, slipping on wet grass, or forgetting that a freshly forged sword is still hot. A knight's body was a diary written by accidents and arrogance. You glance at your hands, blistered, calloused, perpetually dirty, no matter how often you wash them. They don't look noble. They look like a blacksmith's. That's the secret no minstrel sings about. For all the fancy titles, knights were laborers, working bodies forged in iron and endurance. And tonight, those bodies demand repairs. When your squire inspects your mail shirt, he clicks his tongue. 3 rings snapped here, he says, showing you the damage. That will take hours to mend. You both sit cross-legged, linking new iron rings, one by one, using pliers and patience. The process is hypnotic, click, twist, repeat. It's not glorious, but it's grounding. Repair becomes its own kind of prayer. While you work, the camp hums softly. Horses snort, someone plucks a lute, and pots clatter in the distance. The air smells of metal smoke and fatigue. You think of modern athletes in locker rooms after a match, sweaty, sore, replaying every move in their heads. Not so different, really. Except your equipment could kill you if you forgot to oil it. You remember Sir William Marshall, England's greatest knight, they say, who once fought for hours at a tournament, then spent the night mending his own gear so he could fight again the next day. The man was nearly 60 at the time. You shake your head. Even legends get blisters. Your squire hands you a small knife and gestures at a cut on your thigh. It needs cleaning. You grimace, slice the fabric open to check the wound. Shallow but nasty. He pours wine on it. You curse under your breath. then laugh. That's good wine, you say. Then it'll heal rich, he answers. The banter helps. So does the laughter. A night's post-battle evening isn't heroic, it's domestic. You hang armor to dry scrape mud off boots, oil leather straps. It's a scene more suited to a stable than a saga. But there's an odd peace in it. After a day of noise silence feels like luxury. You catch your reflection in the dull steel of your breastplate. For a second, you barely recognize yourself. Your hair's matted, your eyes red, but beneath the grime, you're alive. You trace a finger along a new dent near the heart and murmur, "Close one." Your squire overhears and says, "Everyone's close when you're still standing." Some knights would pray at this point. Others would drink. You do a bit of both. You sip something that might once have been wine and whisper thanks, though you're not sure to whom. The night hums quietly around you, and somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer begins again, beating rhythm into the dark. Your body aches, your mind buzzes, but you find a strange gratitude in these small routine acts. The world has stopped spinning just long enough for you to feel human again, and that's enough for now. The smell hits you before the warmth does. Bread hard flat, a day past edible warming over a smoky fire, and broth simmering in an iron pot that's seen more campaigns than some nights. You'd think warriors would feast after victory, but the truth, dinner in a battlefield camp feels more like a low-budget picnic than a royal banquet. You sit cross-legged with your men still half-armored, waiting your turn as the cook ladles out something suspiciously beige. He swears it's mutton stew. You're not convinced. The broth is thin enough to read scripture through, and whatever meat floats in it might once have been goat pigeon or imagination. Still, after a day of noise, this simple act eating is the closest thing to peace you'll get. Across from you, a young archer dips stale bread into his bowl and mutters, "Better than dying hungry." He's right. Every spoonful tastes of smoke salt and exhaustion. You chew slowly, feeling your jaw work like it's made of rust. Funny how in battle you crave glory, but afterward all you want is soup that doesn't taste like despair. Meals like this were the great equalizer of war. Lords, knights, squires, archers, everyone ended up squatting around the same fire when supplies ran low. Hierarchy dissolved into hunger. You might share your bowl with the same man who earlier carried your banner. Tonight, you're both just tired humans with sore backs and muddy boots. Someone cracks a joke about St. Lawrence, the martyr, who was roasted alive and supposedly said, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." The camp bursts into tired laughter. Humor, dark and half despairing, is the unofficial language of survival. You laugh too, spoon clinking against metal, because laughter burns cleaner than fear. You notice your squire beside you, gnawing on a crust like a squirrel. He asks, "Do knights really dine on silver at court?" You nod. "And here we dine on iron." He smirks. "Then we're nobler for it." You nearly choke laughing. The boy's wit might get him farther than his sword someday. There's an odd beauty in these nights. The flicker of fire paints faces in gold and shadow. Armor gleams like fish scales. Smoke curls upward into a sky, already forgetting the day's horror. Someone begins to hum a tune, slow, melancholic, probably about a woman none of you will ever meet again. It drifts through the camp like incense. You can't help but think of modern soldiers and their camp songs, the way melody keeps sanity stitched together. Maybe humanity has always needed a chorus after chaos. A priest passes by, muttering a blessing over the pot, probably hoping divine favor will add flavor. No one stops eating. Faith, like salt, is best when sprinkled lightly. You remember a banquet years ago in a castle hall, long before this campaign silked banners roast swan-spiced wine. Every dish was designed to remind men of their power. Now, staring into your tin bowl, you realize humility has a flavor too. It tastes of mud and wood smoke, but it keeps you alive longer than pride ever did. Some of the men around you play dice with bone cubes carved from an old ox. The stakes aren't money, but bread crusts, an onion, maybe a swallow of ale. Gambling after bloodshed seems strange, but it helps reset the mind. Death loses its edge when you can laugh about losing to chance. One night at the edge of the fires, starts telling a story, something about fighting in Spain, about how his helmet got stuck backward in the heat of battle and he nearly charged in the wrong direction. The whole camp roars. You added, at least your honor faced the right way. He tosses a crust at you in mock outrage. It's camaraderie forged not by victory, but by ridiculousness. Occasionally you hear horses whinnying in the dark, a distant owl, the low rumble of thunder miles away. The world feels enormous again, not just a few yards of mud and steel. You tilt your head back, see a slice of moon above the smoke, and for a fleeting second, you think of home, your castle, your orchard, the smell of fresh bread not cooked over fear. You don't linger on it. Nostalgia can be a dangerous luxury here. A sudden shout breaks your thoughts. Someone found a rat in the flour sack. The men cheer as if it were a prize boar. The cook grimaces but tosses it aside and keeps stirring. You pretend not to notice. Hunger is good at forgiving what pride won't. Between mouthfuls, conversation shifts from humor to reflection. A veteran near you says quietly, "You ever notice how food tastes different after each battle?" You nod, like the air's changed flavor. He says, "Maybe it's just us who've changed." You don't answer. Some truths sit better unsaid. If there's one thing you learn out here, it's that survival depends less on courage and more on appetite. An appetite for life, for warmth, for one more meal even when your stomach turns. Every spoonful is an act of defiance, proof that you're still here, still hungry for tomorrow. And as you lick the last drop of broth from your spoon, you feel something close to satisfaction. Not the kind sung about in ballads, but the kind that hums quietly in your bones. I made it through another day. When the last bowls are scraped clean and the fire sinks into embers, the camp shifts into something softer. Stillness thick enough to hear your own pulse. The smell of wine and ash lingers in the air, mingling with the faint metallic scent of armor. Someone nearby starts murmuring a prayer. Others follow their voices, overlapping in half-remembered Latin. After the noise of battle, even whispering feels holy. You kneel beside your cot sword, laid flat before you blade, reflecting candlelight like a trembling river. Your hands are still cracked from the day's work, but you clasp them anyway. In the stillness, prayer isn't performance, it's survival. You whisper for forgiveness, though you're not sure which sins count tonight. Was it the killing, the fear, the quiet satisfaction that you were the one who walked away, breathing around you? Men of every rank bend their heads toward the same invisible ceiling. The camp's makeshift chapel is nothing more than a canvas tent with a wooden cross stuck in the mud. But it hums with a power cathedral's sometimes missed desperation. A priest moves between the rows, his robe stiff with dust. He smells faintly of incense and horsehair. You envy him. His armor is faith alone. The prayers come in patterns, like waves. Miserere nobis. Forgive us. Some men pray loudly, eager to drown out their memories. Others barely move their lips. You've seen soldiers who never set foot in a church suddenly clutching rosaries as if they were lifelines. It's funny how religion in war oscillates between theater and therapy. You're not sure which one you're part of. When your turn comes for confession, you hesitate. What can you even say? Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I killed for a paycheck and pretended it was honor. The priest doesn't flinch. He's heard worse. You mutter something about duty, courage, mercy. He nods slowly, gives a small absolution, and tells you to sleep with peace in your heart. You almost laugh. Peace out here, it's rarer than clean water. Still, his words linger. Peace, even if borrowed, is worth holding. You rise feeling strangely lighter. Outside, you catch sight of your squire tracing a small cross on his chest, eyes squeezed shut. He's too young to know what sin feels like yet, but you admire the effort. Faith, like armor, fits differently on every man. Some knights carry their own saints into battle, tiny relics sewn into belts or hidden in boots. You once had a charm, a sliver of bone said to belong to Saint Maurice, patron of soldiers. You lost it in a river years ago, but sometimes you still reach for it instinctively, like checking an empty pocket. Superstition maybe, but it helps. The line between faith and fear is paper thin when you've seen what swords can do. One knight nearby whispers a psalm, his voice trembling but sure. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. The rest of the men murmur the ending with him, for thou art with me. For a moment the tent becomes something sacred. You feel goosebumps crawl up your arms, not from chill, but from the realization that courage often sounds exactly like trembling faith. There are other prayers too less holy, more human. A man prays for his wife's health, another for his horse's recovery. One simply asks, Lord, let me see another sunrise. You can't help but smile. Prayer doesn't need to be poetic to work. Sometimes it just needs to be honest. If this were a cathedral, a chronicler might write about radiant stained glass and angelic choirs. But here holiness smells like damp wool and tallow smoke. God feels closer when the roof leaks. You find yourself whispering, not for victory, but for gentleness, something the battlefield keeps beating out of you. You remember stories of knights who made private vows before battle promises to saints, to lovers, to themselves. Some swore to fast, others to free prisoners, a few to build chapels if they survived. You once promised to ride barefoot to Canterbury if you lived through Poitiers. You didn't. You rode back in full boots and half-belief. Maybe that's why you still feel uneasy under the stars. Tonight you try again. You close your eyes and whisper a quiet bargain. If you let me keep my men alive this week, I'll lay down my sword one day and do something decent. You know how that sounds, like all the other bargains, whispered across centuries by people caught between guilt and gratitude. But it's sincere, and for now, that's enough. Outside, a few soldiers light votive candles, their flames bending in the breeze. Tiny stars against the dark. You realize the whole camp looks like a sky turned upside down, souls flickering, some bright, some fading. You wonder which one you are tonight. As the last prayers fade, silence settles again, thicker than before. You lie back on your cot, still feeling the rhythm of the psalm in your chest. For the first time in days, your breathing sinks with the quiet. Maybe that's what faith really does. It slows the world down, just long enough for you to remember you're still here. The candle beside you flickers once, then steadies. You close your eyes. Somewhere beyond the tent, an owl hoots, a sound that feels halfway between warning and lullaby. You take it as both. Morning drips in slowly through the seams of the tent, soft and gray, like water leaking through a roof. You wake to the sound of quills scratching on parchment and realize that today won't involve swords, but sentences. And war words are sometimes sharper than blades. Your squire hands you a folded scrap of vellum, the kind that smells faintly of sheep and ink and a piece of charcoal. For home, he says, before ducking away to fetch water. You stare at the blank page for a long time. Writing a letter after battle is an exercise in selective memory. You can't write, "I watched a man die for a flag. I barely remember why I carry." Instead, you write, "God has kept me safe, and I think of you each night by the fire." It's not a lie exactly. It's a kind of mercy. Across the camp, other knights and squires are doing the same. Some dictate to scribes who dip their quills like surgeons, careful not to waste precious ink. The air is filled with murmurs. To my wife, to my brother, to my lord. You wonder how many of these letters will actually reach their destinations. Some will be lost in rivers, some in raids, and some intercepted by hands that will never understand the handwriting. You write slowly, the charcoal smudging against your thumb. You mention the weather, the victory, and that your horse is recovering well. You do not mention the nightmares. You sign it with the same line you always do. Yours in faith and duty. It sounds noble, but it really means I'm still alive. Then comes the part few outsiders imagine sealing and dispatching. A knight's messenger network was its own labyrinth of trust. Letters were rolled tied with silk and pressed with your personal wax seal your identity in red. Your squire handles the wax, carefully blowing on it to cool the edges. He seems proud, as though the seal itself carries power. And in a way it does. A letter from a knight could change fortunes faster than a sword stroke. You've seen it happen, messages traded in courtyards, love notes disguised as reports, promises of dowries or truces hidden between lines. The medieval world ran on rumor as much as religion. A clever letter could topple alliances, ignite feuds, or win hearts faster than a lute song. Speaking of hearts, your squire eyes you curiously as you tuck another folded note into your satchel. "That one's not for your lord, is it?" he says. You grin. "No, for a lady who deserves better poetry than I can manage." He laughs. In truth, knights were as entangled in courtly love as they were in battle strategy. Love letters were another battlefield ink instead of blood, wit instead of steel. You think of the famous exchange between Sir Thomas Malory's lovers or the whispered notes of Lancelot and Guinevere, two hearts so loud they nearly drowned out the entire concept of chivalry. Those letters weren't just romance. They were rebellion in cursive. A knight's quill could commit greater treason than his sword ever could. After your writing is done, you step outside and find a small crowd forming near the heralds. They're posting notices, lists of the fallen debts owed marriages arranged. Each name is a story condensed to a line of ink. You scan the list and spot two familiar ones, men you dined beside 3 nights ago. The ink looks too clean for what it represents. You touch the edge of the parchment, then step back, suddenly aware of how thin paper feels between life and memory. Letters and tokens circulate through the camp like veins of quiet emotion. You see a knight holding a locket, turning it over and over. Another man receives a tiny embroidered favor from home, a square of silk that smells faintly of lavender. He presses it to his face, eyes closed. It's strange how something so small can carry an entire person inside it. Sometimes you think this exchange of letters and trinkets is the real economy of war. Not silver, but sentiment. Every scrap of parchment, every ribbon, every wax seal is a promise trying to outrun mortality. As you walk past the courier tents, you overhear gossip rumors about noble betrayals, secret alliances, and scandals brewing far from the front lines. A knight in mud-stained armor leans over and mutters, "Half the wars start with whispers, not weapons." You can't argue with that. Back in your tent, you recheck your own letters. One to your family, one to your commander, one to the lady whose name you never say aloud. You tie them neatly with a cord and mark them with your crest, a faded lion rampant. Your squire watches as you hand them to the courier. What if he doesn't deliver them? He asks. Then you say someone else will read them, and think of me for a moment. That's enough immortality for any man. As the courier rides off, you feel oddly hollow, like part of you just left on horseback. You sit back down, staring at the candlelight flickering against the tent wall. For all your armor and training, this riding ceiling sending is the most vulnerable thing you do. Outside, someone starts singing softly in French, a ballad about lovers divided by war. You can't make out all the words, but the tune is familiar. It's the same one your lady once hummed by the window. The memory stings in a way even arrows can't replicate. You lie back listening to the camp rustle and fade. For now the battlefield has shrunk to something human again. Quills, hearts, and fragile words carried into the unknown. And somewhere miles away, someone will unfold one of those words, smile faintly, and whisper your name into the air. The moon hangs like a burnished coin over the camp, and sleep refuses to come. You step outside the night air, cool against your bruised skin, and realize that while others dream, you must keep your body from forgetting how to fight. The war might rest, but muscle memory never does. Your sword feels lighter now, balanced as if it too craves movement. You walk toward a patch of open ground just beyond the tents, where the grass is damp and silver under the moonlight. It's quiet except for the faint clatter of a distant forge. You stretch your arms, roll your shoulders, and begin the slow, deliberate ritual that every knight knows by heart, training by moonlight. Most people imagine knights as fearless heroes born knowing how to fight. In truth, skill rusts faster than iron. You swing parry pivot, the dance you've done since you were 12, when a wooden sword felt heavier than destiny. The rhythm returns like a song you thought you'd forgotten. Step, turn, breathe. You count under your breath, not in words, but in heartbeat. Your squire follows, rubbing his eyes, dragging a practice spear behind him. You can't sleep either, he mumbles. You shake your head. No. The mind replays what the body hasn't mastered. He nods as if he understands, though his yawn betrays him. You hand him the spear. Then let's make it worth being awake. The boy hesitates. Now, after all that, especially after all that you say, tomorrow's fear begins tonight. He grins nervously and raises the weapon. You square off. The first strike he throws is clumsy. Your parry nearly sends the spear spinning. But you don't scold him. Every knight once looked foolish beneath a patient moon. You correct his stance place, his foot adjust his grip. Feel the weight, you tell him. Don't fight the weapon, let it guide you. He nods and tries again. Training like this isn't about strength. It's about rhythm. The strange poetry of survival. Each move is a verse, each breath a rhyme. In daylight, it's technique. At night, it becomes meditation. You both move through the patterns, thrust, sweep, retreat. The wet grass glistens with your footprints. The night wraps around you like armor made of silence. Sometimes you catch your reflection in a puddle and see what looks like a ghost, a man trapped between devotion and exhaustion. But then the next move demands focus, and the ghost vanishes. You remember what your old master once said. A true knight doesn't fight for the thrill of the charge, but for the calm that comes after the strike lands true. Back then you thought it was nonsense. Now it's gospel. The moonlight catches the blade's edge, and for a second it flashes bright as day. You pause, breathing hard. Your chest rises and falls, heart steadying into the rhythm of a drum you didn't know you were still following. The squire watches wide-eyed. You make it look easy, he says. You laugh softly. Only because I've failed at it longer than you've been alive. You let him rest and take over the drill yourself, practicing forms in slow motion. Each movement becomes a memory. The time you nearly lost your footing on a muddy slope, the moment you learned to turn defense into offense by accident. The body remembers things the mind wishes it could forget. At the edge of the clearing, a few other knights have gathered, drawn by the soft clinks and grunts. One joins in silently mimicking your swings. Then another. Soon there's a small constellation of moving figures' armor catching moonlight, like scales weapons slicing faint silver arcs through the dark. No orders, no trumpets, just shared muscle memory. Someone begins to hum a low rhythm, half tune, half breath. It keeps everyone in sync. You smile, it feels almost like a dance floor after a feast, except your partners carry steel instead of wine. There's a story about the great knight, Jean de Carouge, who trained through nights so often that his servants joked the moon was his mistress. When he finally fought his famous duel in 1386, he credited her for his endurance. You think about that and wonder how many victories in history were really just the result of sleepless practice sessions like this repetition disguised as devotion. The squire yawns again. You toss him a water skin and motion for him to sit. Why keep training, he asks. The battle's done. You point toward the horizon. Because peace never lasts longer than the dawn. He nods silent understanding in the way that youth understands truth without yet feeling its weight. You sheath your sword, hearing the metal slide home like punctuation at the end of a sentence. The field around you glows faintly with fog, every breath visible, every sound amplified by stillness. For a moment you stand there, sweat cooling on your skin, watching the moon balance above the campfires. You realize that these quiet hours between exhaustion and dawn is when nights actually become nights. Not in glory, but in discipline. Not in songs, but in silence. When you finally return to your tent, your muscles ache, but your mind feels lighter. The squire collapses instantly into sleep, snoring softly, spear still clutched in his hand. You smile, blow out the candle, and let the night's rhythm settle into your bones. Outside, the moon keeps watch, like an old friend, steady, unjudging silver as the edge of your blade. At sunrise, the first sound you hear isn't a trumpet. It's coughing. Rough, rasping, human. You lift the tent flap and find your squire slumped beside the fire, rubbing his eyes with soot-streaked fingers. His face looks older this morning, though he's barely 16. For all the songs about knights, it's the squires who keep the myth standing upright. He's already scrubbing your armor with sand and vinegar sleeves rolled to the elbow. The smell of metal and acid stings your nose. You tell him to rest. He shakes his head. Can't, he mutters. It's almost clean. That's his pride talking. Young men's pride is always louder than pain. You remember being that age, too eager to prove your worth to anyone who'd look. You sit beside him and take a piece of the rag, helping him polish the breastplate. The surface slowly clears until you can see both your faces, reflected his narrow and hopeful. Yours lined and tired. You'll hate this one day, you tell him. He grins. Then I'll be doing it right. Squires did everything. Cook clean bandage wounds, feed horses, fetch water, repair armor, even help carry wounded men after battle. They were apprentices in the most brutal classroom imaginable. Some never graduated. Others rose to knighthood only to wish they hadn't. Your own mentor, Sir Alaric of Devon, once told you, "A knight is just a squire with scars." At the time, you laughed. Now you nod silently at the memory. Your squire stops scrubbing long enough to unwrap his own hands, raw from work, knuckles swollen. You hand him a small strip of linen. Wrap them, you say. He shrugs. You didn't? You raise an eyebrow. And that's why mine look like tree bark. He laughs, but he listens. Behind you, the camp begins its daily noise, horses snorting pots, clanging men groaning as they stretch stiff limbs. The sun catches the wet grass, turning every droplet into a spark. You think about how most history books will never mention this hour, the in-between of war, when life is all chores and exhaustion and small kindnesses. Later, you and the boy head to the stream to fetch water. The path there winds through trampled earth, littered with broken spears and bent arrows. He skips a stone across the surface. Do you ever think about quitting? He asks. You pause. Every day. Then why stay? Because someone has to teach the next fool not to make the same mistakes. He grins. Then I guess I'm the fool. You smile, for now. He hauls the bucket up with effort, water sloshing over his boots. You don't help him. Some lessons need strain. Back at camp, he sets the water near the horses, wipes his forehead, and stands taller for having done it himself. There's pride in small victories, too. Knighthood, for all its ceremony, is built on dependency. You rely on him for your sword's edge, your horse's saddle, your very meals. In return, he relies on you for something harder to define, direction maybe, or dignity. The bond isn't romanticized in songs, but it's real. A knight without a squire is half a man, and a squire without a knight is half a dream. You think of William Marshall again, the greatest of them all. When he was a squire, he nearly starved during a siege, eating scraps from pig troughs. Years later, as a knight, he fed his own squires first, even when food ran short. You tell your boy that story while you share a stale loaf. Remember, you say no one stays on top forever. The test isn't how high you rise, but how you treat the one still climbing. He nods thoughtfully, mouth full of bread. Then after a pause, you think I'll ever be like you? You chuckle. I hope you'll be better. Later that morning, he tends to the horses while you check weapons. You watch him from a distance, how carefully he brushes the animals, how he hums under his breath. You realize you're seeing a younger version of yourself, one that still believes the world runs on effort and decency. You almost envy him for it. By noon, the camp smells of hay and smoke. The squire brings your freshly cleaned mail, each link gleaming like fish scales. Looks new, he says proudly. You clap his shoulder. It does. And for a moment, you forget the bruises beneath it. In truth, every knight carries two kinds of armor, the steel that protects his body and the loyalty that protects his soul. The first rusts quickly. The second depends entirely on the hands that polish it. You decide to give your squire something small, a token. From your pouch, you pull a leather strap bearing your family's sigil, faded but intact. Here, you say, fastening it around his wrist. A reminder that service isn't slavery. He stares at it like you've handed him a relic. I'll earn it, he says. You already are. That evening, as the camp settles, he falls asleep sitting upright, still holding a whetstone in one hand. You take it from him gently and set it down. Watching him, you realize that this boy with his blistered palms and half-finished courage is your mirror, and maybe your redemption. The fire cracks softly, and you find yourself whispering a quiet prayer. Not for victory, not for gold, but for him. That he'll live long enough to learn that courage isn't loud, and that loyalty once given freely is worth more than any title ever forged. Night returns like a heavy blanket, and for once there's no singing, no dice, no laughter. The men have eaten, prayed, and now lie sprawled across straw mats like fallen statues. You, however, are wide awake, staring at the fabric of your tent, as if it were the sky itself. Victories are loud, but guilt whispers. And tonight, it has your full attention. You close your eyes, but your mind won't stop replaying the faces. The archer who took an arrow to the throat, the enemy knight who fell into your path, the way his eyes widened in surprise rather than pain. It all comes back uninvited. People think knights dream of glory. They don't. They dream of judgment. You turn over, press your palms to your temples. Sleep refuses to come because your conscience won't let it. "Thou shalt not kill the priest," said earlier, his voice still echoing somewhere in your skull. But wasn't that commandment conveniently flexible on the battlefield? You'd asked him once how soldiers sleep after war. He smiled sadly and said, "Some never do." Your squire mumbles in his sleep beside you, probably dreaming of feasts or heroism. You envy him. He still thinks valor can be clean. You did too once. You remember your first campaign, riding under a bright banner, believing the world divided neatly into good and evil? Now you know it's mostly mud in between. A gust of wind tugs at the tent flap and you sit up rubbing your eyes. Outside, the moon is gone, replaced by a cloudy haze that makes everything look ghostly. The camp feels like a graveyard of breathing men. You walk quietly among them, careful not to step on outstretched limbs. Someone mutters a prayer. Another shivers violently in his sleep. Nightmares travel fast out here. You stop beside the fire pit, now nothing but glowing coals. You pick up a stick, poke the embers until they flare briefly, revealing faces around you, scars, open mouths, twitching eyes. You wonder if courage can ever coexist with memory. There's an odd superstition among knights that dreams after battle reveal divine messages. Some claim St. Michael visits them. Others speak of demons. You're not sure what visits you, but it's not holy. You've seen too much to think God's handwriting is that shaky. You sit there staring into the embers until shapes start forming in the glow. For a moment, it looks like the outline of a helmet, then a pair of eyes, then nothing. You sigh. You tell yourself it's just fatigue. But deep down you know it's something else, the part of your soul that still demands to be seen. Your thoughts drift to confession again. What if the priest was right? What if, when this is all over, you stand before God not as a knight but as a man, with blood on his hands and excuses in his mouth? You'd like to believe intent matters, but intent is easy. Consequence is heavy. You lean back, looking at the stars breaking through the clouds. They seem indifferent, like spectators to a play they've already seen too many times. Maybe they watch the Romans, the Crusaders, the same endless procession of armored men, convincing themselves their violence had purpose. You wonder how long humanity can keep writing that same script. It's not all dread. There's also tenderness, unexpected, confusing. You think of the man you pulled from the mud yesterday, a wounded enemy you gave water to. His face flashes in your memory, pale trembling, when your eyes met something unspoken passed between you, a recognition that you were both temporary. That moment lingers stronger than the fight itself. You think about your family, your land, the idea of home. What is home now? A castle, a wife who writes you careful letters full of hope she doesn't really feel. A child who may not even remember your face. You try to recall their voices, but war has a way of sanding the edges off memory. All that remains is the echo of what you love, dulled by distance. The wind picks up again, fluttering torn banners. Somewhere a horse snorts. You find a small flask near the fire, someone's leftover wine, and take a sip. It burns like confession. You've met older knights who stopped feeling guilt decades ago. They move through war like stones in a river, worn smooth, unbothered. You can't decide if that's wisdom or damnation. Maybe both. A few tents away, a man starts muttering in his sleep, shouting names. You recognize one his brother killed 2 weeks ago. You walk over gently, shake him awake. He blinks confused. "You're safe," you whisper. He nods half-conscious, then falls back asleep. For a moment you envy his ability to slip back into oblivion so easily. Back at your own tent, you lie down again. The straw rustles under your weight. You stare at the ceiling, tracing patterns in the fabric where candlelight used to flicker. If there's a meaning to all this cycle of duty, death, and doubt, it's buried deep under mud and memory. And yet somehow you still believe in something, a faint, stubborn light that refuses to go out. Maybe it's faith. Maybe it's just survival instinct wearing a halo. You're not sure anymore. But you cling to it because without it, all this noise and blood would mean nothing at all. Finally, exhaustion wins. Your eyelids grow heavy. As you drift towards sleep, you hear faint bells in the distance, or maybe they're only in your head. Either way, the sound feels like mercy. Dawn arrives like a reluctant apology, soft gray, and smelling faintly of damp wool and smoke. You blink awake, unsure for a moment if it's a new day or just the same one starting over again. The camp stirs around you, horses stamping fires being coaxed back to life, men muttering curses that sound half like prayers. The world, it seems, has decided to keep going, whether your conscience is ready or not. Your squire is already up, fumbling with your gauntlets, yawning so wide, it's contagious. "We move again?" he asks. You nod. Orders came at dawn. The boy sighs but doesn't complain. He's learning that war never really ends. It just shifts its scenery. You stretch bones crackling like dry branches and pull on your tunic. The cloth is still stiff with yesterday's sweat, but it's easier not to care. Outside, the horizon glows faint pink beneath clouds, and dew glitters across the trampled grass. You can see the outlines of banners in the distance, bright colors dulled by mist fluttering like weary hearts. Someone nearby is already sharpening swords, the rhythmic scrape echoing like a clock ticking toward inevitability. Your squire helps fasten your breastplate fingers, quick practice now. He's gotten good, too good, maybe. You think about how much of boyhood gets hammered out of a person by proximity to steel. He adjusts the strap at your shoulder and says, "You think today will be worse?" You glance toward the east where the road disappears into the haze. They're all worse in different ways. The camp smells of smoke leather and impatience. You notice a priest once again moving through the rows, blessing men and horses alike. His voice rises and falls like the sea. A few soldiers make jokes under their breath, but you don't. You bow your head as he passes. Yesterday's doubt still clings to you like mud, but something inside still reaches for grace, even if it never finds it. Then come the heralds shouting names and orders. The familiar chaos unfolds, armor clanging, horses protesting, men arguing about missing helmets. It's almost comical how mundane the machinery of war looks up close. You imagine some chronicler centuries from now writing about this moment, describing it as noble or gallant. You wish he could see the reality, mud-caked boots, hangovers, and the grim efficiency of people too tired to care about poetry. Your squire hands you your helmet last. You hold it for a moment before putting it on. The inside still smells faintly of iron and last night's sweat. You take a deep breath and slide it over your head. The world immediately narrows to the slit of your visor, dark, tunneled, and humming with the sound of your own breath. The transformation is instant. 1 second you're a man, the next you're a symbol. As you mount your horse, you glance back toward the camp. Fires are being stamped out, tents collapse the temporary city of last night, already vanishing. It's strange how quickly traces of life are erased, how every dawn turns what was once shelter into just more ground to march over. You think of all the mornings before this one. The first campaign when dawn felt exciting. The middle years when it felt routine. And now when it feels like the sigh between two long breaths. Somewhere deep inside you sense that this might be your last ride, though you can't explain why. Perhaps every night feels that way at some point. Your squire jogs beside your horse, his new token the leather strap you gave him swinging at his wrist. He notices you watching and grins. You'll want that back one day, he teases. No, you say quietly. It's supposed to stay with you. As the column begins to move, the sun finally breaks through, catching the edges of armor and turning them to light. For a brief moment, the entire company glows, men transformed into mirrors, reflecting dawn itself. It's almost beautiful. Almost. The march begins, slow rhythmic hooves thudding in unison. Every sound feels amplified. The jangle of bridles, the groan of wood, the murmur of prayers repeated under breath. Your thoughts drift back over the past days, the counting of the living, the quiet deals, the bruises, the laughter, the letters, the training, the sleepless nights. It all feels circular, as if this life only loops, never ends. You think about the stories people will tell about nights like you. They'll remember the battles, the banners, the heroics, but never the in-between moments, the sore shoulders, the muddy jokes, the whispered doubts, the cracked hands of the boys who made the armor shine. Maybe that's fine. History prefers symbols to souls. Still, you wish they'd understand one thing, that being a knight isn't about fearlessness, it's about function. You fight because it's your role, not your glory. You march because stopping would mean remembering too much. You pray because silence gets too loud. A rider gallops past, shouting new directions. The army veers east toward the rising light. You look once more at your squire, who trudges alongside determined eyes, bright despite the fatigue. You'll make a fine knight, you tell him. He shakes his head. Only if I have a teacher who lives long enough to see it. You laugh a rough, tired sound, but it's real. The road stretches ahead, endless and uncertain. You tighten your reins, feeling your horse shift beneath you. The wind catches your cloak, lifting it like a banner. Somewhere far away, a church bell rings, faint, steady, promising. Another day you haven't yet earned, but will face anyway. And so you ride forward toward another dawn, another dust-choked road, another banner waiting in the wind. Not as a legend, not even as a hero, but as a man who endures. Because in the end, that's the truest secret of all knights, never stop marching. They just learn to carry the weight a little quieter each time.